Milling Through History presents The Betrayer of Anne Frank. The Diary of Anne Frank became an international bestseller after the Second World War, and children around the world have read this book, and oftentimes the most common question which is asked when it comes to the book, the performance of the play, or even the viewing of the film is invariably going to be the very same question. Who betrayed Anne Frank and her family? Now, this particular mystery is one that really has no easy and direct way to answer. In fact, people have been trying to figure that out for decades. After the war itself, Otto Frank, the only member of the family to survive the war, attempted to find out the answer. Now, part of his attempts to find out the answer was aided by the Dutch government, as in 1947, the government would prosecute those citizens who collaborated with the Nazis during the war. Now, when this mass hunt for Nazi collaborators was going through the Netherlands, Otto Frank was on the front lines, trying to find the perpetrator of this betrayal. But he didn't quite necessarily know who to go after. But throughout his search, he continued to do so, and then eventually moved on towards promoting and publicizing and putting out knowledge of Anne's diary and her thoughts during her period of hiding during the Second World War. In 1963, the Dutch government would have a second round of investigations for any of the collaborators they might have missed the first time through. And during this second go-around, Otto Frank was not as vested in the search for the perpetrator as he was the first time. And so this immediately begs a question. Why is it he did not want to go after this individual the second time through? Was he successful? And if he was, why didn't anybody know about this? Well, it's very difficult to say, but a close examination of interviews from Otto Frank after 1963 begins to shed light on the reason for it. And the primary reason is because Otto Frank did indicate that he knew the identity of the perpetrator, and that the individual in question was not only dead, but, in a bit more of a crueler twist of irony, was Jewish in addition. And so, now this creates a new question. Who could this perpetrator have been? Well, prior to tracking down interviews where Otto admitted knowing that the perpetrator was Jewish and dead, many suspects had come up through the years. One of the primary suspects was an unknown thief who had broken into the building where the Franks were hiding, and it was believed he may have heard the family scurrying about to hide themselves during that break-in. And when arrested by the Nazis, would say, well, if you let me go, I'll tell you where there are some Jews hiding. This had always been one of the more popular theories, but other theories had come up, including known Nazi perpetrators, disgruntled employees of Otto Frank, all of which had some forms of legitimacy. Now, using the Frank interview where he acknowledges the fact that the perpetrator was Jewish and had already died, closer examinations revealed that the individual who betrayed the Franks had died prior to 1960. And so now the window suddenly decreases. The person was alive in 1944 and dead 16 years later. In 2022, a cold case investigative report was published and had been worked on for a better part of 8 years. This report would show who they believed could have been the perpetrator behind betraying the Frank family. And through careful examination, they were able to identify 8 possible suspects, but going through them all, only one stood out as being the potential individual that betrayed this group of people. And the individual that they had figured could answer the question of who betrayed Anne Frank was a man by the name of Arnold Vandenberg. Born in 1886, Vandenberg was a Jewish notary who lived in Amsterdam. Now, notaries are rather important people for the Dutch, namely because they hold a surprisingly large amount of power. The reason for this is that they would have lists of all proprietary transactions that occurred within the city or territory that they were covering. As such, They would always be at every sale, and they would have to have a copy of all legal paperwork. This meant that any time a Jewish individual within Amsterdam or somewhere in the Netherlands tried to buy a secret property or sell off their goods into some dummy location, the notary would have a record of it. Now, after the Nazi occupation began, Vandenberg became part of the Jewish Council in Amsterdam. The purpose of the council was to act as a go-between for the Nazi Party and their Jewish prisoners. However, more often than not, the council was also seen as a den of collaborators. The reason for this is that the Jewish Council would be notorious for identifying those Jews in the Netherlands who were poorer and less affluent, and therefore they should be the first ones to be deported off to the death camps. It's no secret that the Jewish Council was well aware of the fate of their fellow religious compatriots. However, it has been argued that in their minds, money talked, and therefore, if you were not part of the upper strata of Jewish society in the Netherlands, then you were fair game to go off first. Oftentimes, the argument as to why they did this was, I had to protect my own family, so I had to send somebody else. And while it could be argued, yes, there is that fight or flight dilemma which occurs, the fact is that there's undeniable evidence to show that there was an economic disparity within the Netherlands between those Jews who were sent off to die first versus those who were sent off to die later. Now, by 1943, the protections that Vandenberg had been able to provide for himself and his family were beginning to be taken away. The biggest one that he had was he was a notary. But after losing his job, at any day, a replacement could show up, and then he would have to hand over all of his files and have nothing to protect himself. In a rather unique twist, Vandenberg decided to go and use the Nazi laws in his favor in order to protect himself and his family. What he did is that he contacted British genealogists to research his family tree and show he only had one Jewish grandparent. In doing this, this would allow him to be declared a non-Jew according to Nazi law. It would take over a year, but the genealogists would prove that Vandenberg only had one Jewish grandparent, and so his classification of being Jewish was removed, and the classification of his daughters being declared Jewish was also removed. The only member of his family that was Jewish was his wife, but she herself would be protected because of her marriage to her husband. Now, it is believed by the cold case team that as a notary, and with his knowledge of all sales that were going on, Vandenberg had used his list of secret Jewish hiding places that he had from his time in the Jewish Council as effectively a delaying tactic to prevent the Nazis from shipping him off to the ghettos and later concentration camp. But then this begs another question. How did the Jewish Council know about these hiding places? The answer is because Jews who were sent to the ghettos would write letters back home to those family members that they knew were hiding, maybe under an assumed name, maybe under a hiding place that friends had provided. And so, in collecting those letters and having them sent first to the Jewish Council, and then the council would have them sent to the family members, the Nazis now had an inside knowledge as to where many individuals were hiding and being kept safe. Now, by the time of 1944, when the war was pretty much over for the Nazis, and everyone knew any day the Allies would come and liberate the Netherlands, the discovery of the Franks seems to have been rather peculiar. The Nazis had thought they had cleared out all of Amsterdam. There couldn't have possibly be any Jews left behind. But the cold case team believed that Vandenberg used the location of the secret annex as a means of trying to delay and stall for time for his paperwork to prove that he wasn't Jewish to come through. When the Nazis arrived to arrest the Frank family, according to Otto Frank, they were surprised to even see the family there, which leads some people to believe that nobody actually expected there to be a secret annex at that location. In fact, they figured that the family may have been already escorted out of the city, and perhaps somewhere on the outskirts they were hidden. But the discovery of Otto Frank, Anne Frank, and the rest of the people in the secret annex came as a big surprise. And had their arrest not occurred in that fateful day in August, they probably would have survived the war completely intact, as the Nazis were getting ready to depart Amsterdam within less than 3 weeks. Now, after the war itself was over, Otto Frank would return home, and upon learning that his entire family was wiped out, began his search for the perpetrator. And it's believed that sometime between 1947 and 1950, he was able to identify Vandenberg as the perpetrator. But why is it that Vandenberg did not become more villainized? Nobody really knows. What is known, though, is that Vandenberg would be diagnosed with cancer and die from the disease in London in 1950. For Otto Frank, it may have been a case of, I can't go after the dead because there's nothing that the dead can do to bring back my loved ones. And as a result, Otto Frank decided that it'd be better to serve the memory of his wife and children by having their story told and making sure people would remember never to allow the events of the Second World War to occur again. As a result, the cold case team determined that yes, Arnold Vandenberg suited the case. Whether or not you might believe that is up to you, as Vandenberg's family has attempted to sue publishers from even releasing the book, which failed miserably, but they still claim that Vandenberg was innocent, that he never committed the crime. And so we may never know if this cold case team got it right or if it was somebody else. But in the meantime, it does show that when it comes to history and rather cruel events, we do ask the question, how can somebody betray another person? In the case of Arnold Vandenberg, his reasoning may have just simply been, I was trying to protect my family. And so if I had to give somebody else up, I would have to do it just to protect those that I love. It may seem like a weak excuse today, but in all honesty, can any of us say we would not have done the same? That's your decision.
For more information, please consider these suggested titles. Be sure to click on the left-hand side of the screen to subscribe to our show, and on the right-hand side for our latest episode. And we will see you again for the next episode of Milling Through History.